Hello and welcome to What Does It Mean to Be in a Lupus Clinical Trial? I'm Annika Hazlitt, a member of the Board of Directors at Kaleidoscope Fighting Lupus, and your host. Here to explain the importance of clinical trials and what they can mean for you as a lupus patient is Dr. Megan Lockwood, clinical rheumatologist, director of the lupus program at Medstar Georgetown University Hospital, and assistant professor of medicine at Georgetown University. Before we hear from Dr. Lockwood, I'd like to thank our title sponsor, Amgen, for their generous support in making this educational video possible. I would also like to thank our community sponsors, Blue-Eyed Crow Studio, Tin Rocket, 7 Minute Cinemas, and Due North Studios for their ongoing support. Now, let's hear from Dr. Lockwood.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I am delighted to be here today to talk with you all about what it means to be in a clinical trial. So for our agenda, we'll be talking briefly about what is lupus. We'll be going over the importance of clinical trials in lupus and understanding major concepts in clinical trials. So starting with what lupus is. Lupus has been called a mystery disease by researchers and physicians. It is a chronic, lifelong autoimmune disease with no cure that can damage any part of the body, including the skin, the joints, and the internal organs. Your immune system is your body's defense system. It protects your body from outside invaders such as bacteria, viruses, and toxins. It's made up of different organs, cells, and proteins that all work together to fight disease. In a person with lupus, the immune system attacks healthy cells and tissues by mistake. Lupus is the leading cause of kidney disease, stroke, and heart disease. There is no cure for lupus, but there is hope. With early detection, managed care, reducing stress, and following a healthy diet and exercise plan, people living with lupus can control their symptoms and even prevent flare-ups from happening. There are different types of lupus. Systemic lupus is the most common. It makes up 70% of lupus patients, and it affects the whole body. There's also something called cutaneous lupus erythematosus, or skin lupus, and that's lupus that causes rashes on the skin but does not affect the inside of the body. There's also something called drug-induced lupus, which can be caused by certain prescription drugs. It's thought that lupus is caused by a combination of genetic predisposition, including ethnicity, and triggered by environmental factors. Anyone can get lupus, but certain people are more likely to be affected by it due to their gender, age, family history, socioeconomic status, and race. 1 in 5 people with lupus have a parent or sibling who's already been diagnosed with it or may go on to develop it. It's also likely that a family member will have another autoimmune disease such as rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, or psoriasis. Lupus is much more common in African Americans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans than it is in white Americans. Lupus symptoms can vary from person to person. Some of the most common symptoms include achy, painful, and swollen joints, extreme fatigue or weakness, sudden unexplained hair loss, and photosensitivity or sensitivity to sunlight. People with lupus can end up feeling very isolated because you can be very sick on the inside and people don't see it on the outside. It can be really difficult to socialize due to their symptoms because those symptoms are often invisible, and friends and family might not fully appreciate the burden of the disease. According to the Lupus Foundation of America, it's estimated that 1.5 million Americans and at least 5 million people globally have a form of lupus. And although lupus affects people of all ages, it's most often diagnosed in women of childbearing age between the ages of 15 and 45. 90% of adults with lupus are women, but it can affect men too. Women of color, including African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, Native Americans, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and other Pacific Islanders, are disproportionately affected by lupus. It's 2 to 3 more common in women of color and usually more severe than in white women. Black African ancestry is associated with a higher prevalence of lupus, greater disease severity, and an increased risk of cardiovascular events, as well as end organ damage and higher mortality rates compared to white people with lupus. We also know that Black people with lupus have lower levels of social support compared to white people with lupus. And what are some of the challenges that are posed by these disparities? The life expectancy of a Black American with lupus is on average 7 years less than white Americans, and it's an average 10-year less than Hispanic Americans. We know that women of color with lupus often receive lower quality medical care, sometimes due to bias or incorrect beliefs by healthcare providers. Racial and ethnic disparities result in a lower quality of life for people of color with lupus. And some medical professionals may actually withhold treatments from people with lupus if they believe the patient may not take their medication properly or regularly. We know that people of color with lupus receive less social support and that rates of depression are nearly twice as high in our Black patients with lupus compared to our white patients with lupus. So, what are some of the guidelines for managing lupus? Tips that I share with my patients. Try to attend all of your medical appointments and communicate regularly with your doctors. Track your symptoms, your triggers, and side effects of your medication and share them with your doctors. Maintain a healthy and well-balanced diet. Get all recommended vaccinations to avoid infections. Take your medications regularly. Most importantly, build a support system and be your own advocate. When you have lupus, it's so important to pay attention to your body. If you can, try not to hide your illness from others. People don't know that you're sick unless you tell them that you're sick. People with lupus often feel invisible. Learn how to anticipate a flare-up and what triggers a flare look like for you. Plan ahead, schedule and structure everything you can, and learn how to say no. It is okay to say no. Limit your time in the sun. Rest and sleep regularly as needed, and discover things that make you happy. So with that in mind, I'd like to speak about the importance of clinical trials in lupus. Accurate representations of participants in clinical trials not only helps to fight health disparities and inequities, it's also just good science. And that's why it's critical that participants accurately represent the populations that potential medications are designed to treat. And despite a greater prevalence of lupus among racial and ethnic minorities, there are marked gaps that exist between populations affected by lupus and those enrolled in clinical trials. The chart here on the left-hand side of the screen represents the prevalence of lupus. You can see that Black people in purple make up a prevalence of 43% of lupus cases. The chart on the right shows the number of patients represented in clinical trials. And you can see that Black people only make up 14% of patients represented in clinical lupus trials. In contrast, going back to the chart on the left, you can see here that 33% of prevalent lupus cases are in white patients, but they are vastly overrepresented in clinical trials, making up over 51% of participants in lupus clinical trials. And we're here today to talk about lupus, but this is not just a problem in lupus. This is a problem in all clinical trials and all diseases. The chart here on the left displays data from the US Census that shows that 60% of people in this country are white, seen here in light blue. But comparing this to US trial statistics as represented in the chart on the right, you can again see that white patients are overrepresented in clinical trials at 80%. The point here is not that we want to discourage white patients from participating in clinical trials, but rather we really want to encourage the participation of everybody else. This has really led to a data gap in lupus. And many would argue this is not just a research problem, but also a problem of social justice. When groups of people are not accurately represented in clinical trials, it can contribute to widening health inequalities. People do not experience diseases or respond to therapies in the same way. And when medical treatments and diseases are not studied in diverse populations, researchers will not get the information they need to understand how certain groups of people are affected. The data gap created from these disparities in clinical trials can impact the development of medical treatments and may lead to diseases going underdiagnosed, untreated, or treated with medicines that may not work as well for certain people. Therefore, diverse participation in clinical trials is necessary for the approval of safe and effective therapies for all patients. And as we talked about earlier, this is particularly important in lupus because significant racial and ethnic disparities exist. Again, we talked about how lupus disproportionately affects our Black and Hispanic patients who have both a greater morbidity and mortality from the disease. We know that our Black patients have a higher prevalence of lupus, greater disease severity, and an increased risk of cardiovascular events, as well as more end organ damage and higher mortality rates compared to white people with lupus. So by participating in clinical trials, you have the power to contribute to the health of your community. Diversity in clinical trials not only helps to fight health inequalities, it can lead to more knowledge about diseases and potential treatments for all. That's why when you take part in a clinical trial, you're supporting your friends, your family, and your entire community. Your participation provides unique and important information that can help researchers and scientists take steps towards developing a healthier world. So let's spend a few minutes to talk about the nitty-gritties of what it means to be involved in a clinical trial. Clinical trials, sometimes called clinical studies, are a type of research that helps scientists to learn more about ways to manage diseases and other medical conditions. In order for medicines to be prescribed or sold in this country, they must go through a long and careful research and approval process. After potential medicines have been through testing in a lab and potentially then tested on animals, clinical trials are then performed to understand if they're generally safe and effective. Many prescriptions and over-the-counter medications are developed using clinical trials. Clinical trials are how we've found ways to treat cancer, HIV/AIDS, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, mental health disease, and lupus. But like we talked about earlier, how medicine works in the body can vary for different groups of people, and some diseases, like lupus, impact certain races more than others. Clinical trials are the only way researchers can understand how diseases and medicines work in people of different ages, races, genders, and more. And diverse participation is necessary for the FDA to approve these new, safe, and effective therapies for all patients. The FDA relies on clinical data from research trials to decide how to approve new drugs and therapies. Clinical trials typically happen in 4 phases or 4 parts, and each phase studies the potential medicine in more people. If the medicine does not work or is not safe in one phase, then it stops and it does not go on to the next phase. So phase 1, seen here on the left, usually starts with a very small group of healthy people or people with the disease, usually about 20 to 100 participants. If the medicine is found to be safe and effective, then it moves to a phase 2 study. Phase 2 is more of a medium size of people who have the disease, about 100 to 200 people. If it passes through the rigorous safety studies at this level, then you move on to a phase 3 trial. A phase 3 trial is a large group of people with the disease, about 300 to 3,000 people will participate. After a phase 3 trial is usually when a drug can be approved. But the studies don't stop there. We still need to make sure that these drugs are safe to use long term. And that's what the phase 4 trials are for. Phase 4 studies look at how the medicine works in the real world after it has been approved and prescribed. It's really important to know what to expect when you're starting to get involved in a clinical trial. So before you join a trial, the study team is going to tell you about the trial as a part of the informed consent process. Informed consent means agreeing to take part in the clinical trial after reading all of the relevant information about the trial and understanding the potential risks and benefits. The study team is always there to answer any questions you or your loved ones may have. Once you get through the informed consent process, the next step is the qualification screening, and that will often include a physical examination and a review of your medical history. Clinical trials have very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria, meaning the key features participants need to have in order to be included in the study. So they need to make sure you have the right features to be in this study. Once you've completed the informed consent process and the qualification screening, you can then decide if you want to enroll in the trial. Participation is completely voluntary, and you are free to leave at any time. During the clinical trial, you'll be asked to take a medication according to the instructions provided by the study team. Your health will be monitored very closely during and after the trial. How it is monitored will depend on your condition and the goals of the study. This will be outlined in detail in the informed consent. You will attend scheduled appointments with the study team at a local study clinic, and most of the time you will be able to continue all of your regular medications and keep up with your regular doctor's visits. Just because you're involved in a clinical trial doesn't mean you're leaving your doctor. Your doctor will still be your doctor. And after the trial has ended, you may be asked to attend a follow-up visit to monitor for any long-term effects of the medication. So there are several important considerations in thinking about participating in a clinical trial. As a patient, you're going to have many questions, and it's important that you make your decisions taking into account all of these considerations. All clinical trials are not the same, and they differ depending on the goals and objectives of the study. Some trials can last for months, others can last for years. In many cases, you may receive compensation for participation in the trial or reimbursement for expenses like travel or childcare. Materials should be provided to you in your native language. These are a list of considerations that you should make sure to ask the study team about. During the trial, your safety is the number one priority, and your health will be closely monitored. You will receive scheduled checkups to monitor health at a clinical site, which could be a doctor's office or a hospital. You will be able to contact your study team at any time with questions or concerns. And during the clinical trial, an independent safety review committee will regularly review the trial's progress and outcomes, including any side effects. Only your study team will be able to see your health information. Your names and identifying information will not be included. And remember, participation is voluntary. You can leave at any time for any reason. The FDA's Let's Take Charge campaign has great resources for patients and care providers. I encourage you to be your own advocate and talk to your healthcare provider about potential clinical trials. You can get support from your family and friends to make the process easier. Sometimes people close to you might actually be asked to be your study partner. They can help by answering questions about changes in their loved one's health or mood, as well as helping get them to and from visits. Your family and friends can actively listen and provide support for you during these studies. Resources are available to help you, your family, and friends to better understand what to expect during a clinical trial. So how do you learn more? Ask your doctor. Be your own advocate. Clinicaltrials.gov is a great resource for all clinical trials that are going on in the United States. And lastly, the Lupus Foundation of America through lupus.org is a wonderful resource. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've learned more about what it might mean to be a participant in a clinical trial and why this is so important for a disease like lupus.
Thank you, Dr. Lockwood, for that very informative description of what patients can expect if they decide to participate in a clinical trial. Let's hope that lupus clinical trials will better represent the actual patient population very soon. Once again, a special thanks to our title sponsor, Amgen, for their generous support in making this educational video possible. Thanks as well to our community sponsors, Blue-Eyed Crow Studio, Tin Rocket, 7 Minute Cinemas, and Due North Studios for their incredible support. And we want to thank you for watching. We encourage you to visit our website, kaleidoscopefightinglupus.org, and follow our social media platforms for the latest lupus news, program information, award-winning blog articles, and so much more. Thanks for spending time with us. And remember, you're not alone. I'm Annika Hazlitt for Kaleidoscope Fighting Lupus. Please take care.